Welcome to Encountering Jesus in John, an Advent study. I'm very excited to get to spend the next 4 weeks with you exploring how Jesus is God's provision for our greatest needs. We'll spend our time together engaging the scriptures, encountering Jesus, exploring how Jesus' life intersects with our own stories, and hopefully experiencing new levels of hope, healing, and freedom. I am hopeful and prayerful that this will contribute to an enriched and meaningful worship experience for you this Christmas. We'll spend our time together with our primary passages out of the book of John. John was believed to have been written by Jesus' disciple John, and the significance of this is twofold. First, John was witness to Jesus' ministry. He was able to see the miracles that Jesus performed. He heard Jesus' teaching. He was intimately acquainted with Christ. And so he's writing it, first of all, as a first-hand witness. But he also was witness to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And he wrote this book after Jesus' resurrection, sometime after. And so now he's not only writing it as a first-hand witness, but he's also getting to write it somewhat in retrospect, where he is able to reflect back to all that Jesus taught and did, and to reflect on the context of what Jesus did in light of the Old Testament, and see how there were parts of the Old Testament that seemed to be pointing forward to Jesus, the one who was to come. And so John is able to bring all of this rich imagery and symbolism together for us so that we can have a fuller understanding of exactly who Jesus was for us. And so I'm excited, which means that what we will do is each week before we spend time in our primary passage in John, we're going to take time to look at the Old Testament context so that we can better understand its symbolism and imagery as well. So in our passage this week, John the Baptist, which is not to be confused with the author of this book, John, Jesus' disciple, proclaims that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Now, those that were listening to John the Baptist proclaim that over Jesus as Jesus passed by would have heard it differently perhaps than we would, because we are looking back. We've got information that they did not have. So what would have come to mind for those who were hearing John the Baptist proclaim Jesus as a Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world? Two ancient traditions may have come to mind for them that were deeply rooted in their history as a people group and in their faith culture. The first would have been that of the Passover, and then the second would have been that of the Day of Atonement. So we had some additional readings from the Old Testament this week that we're going to spend a little bit of time exploring before we move into our New Testament passage. The first would be Exodus 12 and that of the Passover. But before I can even tell you about the Passover, I should give you some backstory to the book of Exodus. So when we come to the book of Exodus, Israel is in slavery in Egypt, and they've been there for over 400 years. At the beginning, we hear that God sees his people's suffering. He hears their cries, and he determines that he is going to deliver them out of the land of their slavery, and he's going to bring them into a land that is flowing with milk and honey, a land that he calls the Promised Land. He is determined that he is going to rescue Israel from the land of their suffering and deliver them into a land of flourishing. Now, he chooses Moses to be his representative, and he sends Moses to Pharaoh of Egypt and to tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. But he warns Moses. He says, Pharaoh is not going to let my people go, so I'm going to send a series of plagues, and after the last plague, Pharaoh will relent and he will let my people go. Now, the last plague was the death of every firstborn within Egypt. And God gave Moses a very specific set of instructions so that Israel might be spared during this plague. So he tells Moses that each household is to take a male 1 year old lamb without spot or blemish. They are to slaughter this lamb. They're to take the blood of the lamb and they're to paint it over the doorposts to the house on the outside of the door. And then they are to prepare this lamb in a very specific way. Everyone in the household is to sit down and to eat or partake of this lamb, to consume it, all of it, leaving nothing behind. And then when the Lord passes through the land and he sees the blood on the doorposts of their house, he will pass them by, and death will not visit their home. But for all those homes that are not marked by the blood of the Lamb, they will experience the death of their firstborn. The Israelites did what Moses had told them to do, and they took shelter under the blood of the Lamb. And quite literally, they were covered by the blood of the Lamb and spared this plague. Pharaoh relents and releases Israel. Now, God gives Moses another set of instructions. He says, I want you to observe this day every year as a commemoration, as a celebration of the day that I brought you out of slavery. And when your children ask why you are celebrating this meal, you will tell them that this is what we are doing to remember how God freed us, how he delivered us from the land of our slavery. So this really was a celebration of freedom and deliverance from suffering and oppression. God had provided a way for his people to be spared. He provided a way for them to be rescued out of this land, and it came through a provisional lamb. It came through a lamb that was slaughtered, and its blood was spilt so that Israel might cover themselves symbolically by its blood, and they would be spared and ultimately now free from their suffering. The second event is out of Leviticus 16, which is another passage that we read for this week, and this is the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is another set of instructions that God had given Moses sometime after Israel had come out of slavery in Egypt. And this was to be observed once per year. This was part of the sacrificial system and the worship system that God had set up for the new community of Israel. And it was the Day of Atonement. And atonement really means reconciliation or reparation or restoration of a broken relationship between God and his people. And it usually happens through some form of sacrifice. So the Day of Atonement was a day on which Israel fasted, and the priest would cleanse the sanctuary and the altar of all impurity. He would do that by taking the blood of a bull and a goat. And then he would also take another goat, and he would lay his hands on this goat, a live goat. He would lay his hands on this goat. He would confess all of the sins of Israel, and then he would send this goat out into the wilderness. And symbolically, this was Israel's sins being removed and carried away. And this is where our term scapegoat comes from. Like, the sins of the people were placed on this innocent one, this goat, and that goat carries Israel's sins away from them, thereby really purifying them and restoring their relationships with God, enabling them to continue to enjoy communion with him. So in both the Passover lamb and the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement, God is providing for Israel's greatest needs. He is providing freedom from their suffering and their oppression. He is providing cleansing of their sins, and He is providing peace with Him, the ability for them to dwell in a relationship with Him as their God and with them as His people. And so now I want to have one more Old Testament passage that we look at together that will hopefully help us to bring this whole picture together. This is going to be out of the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, often called the suffering servant or the sacrificial servant. And this was a prophecy about one who was to come. He was called a man of sorrows who was acquainted with our griefs. In verse 4, it says, He will bear our grief and carry our sorrows. He's going to basically identify with us in our sufferings. And then, verse 5, He is going to be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. So He is going to be the one who is suffering the punishment due us. The judgment for our sin is going to be laid on Him. And Isaiah goes on to say that He will be like a lamb led to the slaughter. So we see in Isaiah almost this bringing together of both the Day of Atonement and the cleansing of sin from Israel through this scapegoat, and the Passover, the slaughtering of a lamb that would enable God's people to be freed from their suffering. And we see that God, through this suffering servant, is going to provide a true sacrificial lamb and a true scapegoat who would fully and finally restore humanity to God. And He was going to rescue them from the land of their slavery, suffering, and sin. He was going to restore their relationship with Him, and He was going to reestablish peace, or shalom. And when we talk about shalom, shalom isn't necessarily, although it can be, the absence of conflict, but it's more than that. It is wholeness. It is the absence of brokenness. So we should reflect back to the fall when God created an abundant land, and everything that He created He pronounced as good, and it was operating as it should. It was abundant and flourishing, and He dwelled among the first man and the first woman in peace, and they were in this land where they were able to flourish. But it should also draw our gaze forward now as modern readers to new creation that we are still anticipating and still awaiting. And so we see that when John calls Jesus the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, this phrase really would have been loaded with meaning for the ancient Jewish listeners, but it's even more so for us, because in the old day, they were relying on the blood of bulls and goats and lambs, but Isaiah was promising, and the Old Testament scriptures were pointing to the fact that there was one to come that they have been pointing to, one who could accomplish forever what the lambs and the goats could only provide temporarily. So that's our Old Testament context, and in our next video we're going to take on our New Testament passage. So I'm excited to join you for that next.